Just this past week, a Johannesburg Metro Police officer was killed in a hit-style case. He was a forensics investigator in the city of Johannesburg Metro Police officer. This is indicative, endemic and demonstrative of the deeply violent society we live in, where the rule of law and the order of law has seemed to have evaded our social norms, and it is a worrying phenomenon. According to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, over the past decade, there has been a staggering 108% increase in targeted killings in South Africa. Such is the violent nature of our society. And sadly, this is not the whole story about the extent of violence in South Africa. Good evening and welcome to today's installment of Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. It's incredibly honored to be in your company this evening. Political killings, violence against women and children, violent protests, taxi violence. The list is endless. Why do we have such a deeply, gratuitously violent society 30 years into South Africa's democracy? To discuss this matter, we have in studio Dr. Lehasa Moloi, who is an Afrocentric Scholar from UNISA's Department of Development Studies, and we also will be joined by another guest on the line. But let's start by looking at this scene setter produced by our producer, Nadia Dambuza. Take a look at this.
Apartheid was a violent ideology, meting violence on its citizens and employing violent means across the length and breadth of South Africa, its borders and beyond, to sustain itself. Some of its brutality was unveiled at the 1996 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which laid bare the scale of the state machinery, its covert and other operations supported by its enforcers who were deployed to crush opposition.
There's one thing that I will have to live till the day I die. It's the corpses that I will have to drag with me to my grave of the people whom I've killed.
Since the dawn of democracy, the reality of the impact of such violence in society was not lost to many. Apartheid's brutality had left lasting psychological scars on both its victims and perpetrators. While from the onset, complaints were increasingly becoming louder about the violent nature of our society, the 2008 xenophobic attacks, which claimed 62 lives, shifted the discourse about the extent to which violence is endemic in South African society. Contrary to expectations, violence has never left the South African society, with some wars transported into the new dispensation. Pre-democratic taxi wars, which were linked to political violence, morphed into commercial competition over routes between different cartels and association after 1994. The Moerane Commission of Inquiry, established in 2018 to investigate political and hostile murders in KZN, concluded that political killings were a result of intra-political conflict, the problem of patronage networks and taxi conflict, some of which their perpetrators are not brought to book.
The matters were withdrawn, but that was beyond the control of the police. For example, where you have your witnesses killed, the key witnesses, and also where you have witnesses that go missing because of the intimidation and influence by the people outside.
Residents in other provinces are equally under siege due to gang violence, car hijackings, residential robberies, business robberies, often with devastating consequences. Statistics show that 1 in every 5 women is abused by their partners, but many of these cases go unreported because women do not trust the police system. Between October and December of 2023, nearly 1,140 women were murdered and more than 20,000 were violently assaulted, and these were only reported cases. Despite the solutions implemented to address violence in South Africa, it is clear that the center is not holding in this country where only 15% of all murders are solved. Nadia Dambuza, Democracy 30.
And I'll bring into the conversation Dr. Lehasa Moloi. Doc, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
A very rudimentary question to start with.
Yeah.
And it is about the epistemology of violence.
Yeah.
Not all of it is physical. Sometimes violence can be unseen, inconspicuous, and perhaps not even physical. In answering the question, why is South Africa such a deeply violent country? How do you take all of those forms of violences into consideration to answer that?
I think it would be very fair to understand that there is no South Africa without violence. And in fact, South Africa as a geographical space remains a crime scene historically of the butchered souls, traceable. The context of the past 30 years was merely about the inclusion of African people into the neo-colonial, neo-apartheid system. But it is when we interrogate this sedimentary political rock of what we had entered in, that when we open up that, we will see the demons of the past revisiting us. And when we go deeper in terms of interrogating fundamentally, what is South Africa? South Africa is begotten through violence.
Are we able to get rid of violence without necessarily having to get rid of the remnants of colonialism or even the ever-present existence of neocolonialism?
I think one of the critical aspects, I'm glad with the first point that you made about the very nature of violence itself. And I would like to take the two-layered reflection on it, that it is both metaphysical, visibilized into the physical. Number one.
What does that mean?
It is a byproduct of some sort of a knowledge of how certain people are viewed. In particular, African people, not only in South Africa, but throughout the rest of the continent, have been regarded by numerous European scholars as the subhuman beast who were uncivilized, without history and without culture. From that basis, it could be easier once they have been reduced from the layer of being human beings to deal with them as animals. So in that way, then your sense of conscience is not being affected because you are purely dealing with an animal. So in a way, we deal with the psychological dimension, the knowledge that we basically have about them and how we look at them, their cultures, which we treat as being some sort of a backward people without the knowledge of anything. Then, once we have conceptualized them in that way, it is much more easier to attack them, because when you are killing, you are not killing a human being. You are actually killing an animal. That's why you could have concepts such as monkeys, and we are therefore seen as the soulless beast in the eyes of the system.
Perhaps to continue borrowing there from the Frank Wilderson type of scholarship around violence. But the state is humanless, the state is non-racial, the state is meant to not see a difference between the human and the subhuman. The state has a monopoly on violence, and the state exercises that to the greater good of society. Why is the state not able to mitigate against all violence?
The current state as we know it, as a byproduct of the aftermath of the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, it is the capturer of power and the unleasher of violence. This state, with the markings of the business brothers, was created precisely to serve that purpose of facilitating business in the interest of those who are the occupants of the state. So African people as they victimized, African people as those who are the violated, become victimized by that. So it is therefore very important, number one, to say that if we situate the historical context of what South Africa is, we will start from 1488, arrival of Bartholomew Dias, 1510, Francisco de Almeida, until we deal with the arrival of the Dutch East Indian Company, and then 1652, Jan van Riebeeck, and then how then they began to deal with the local people that they find on the land. There was never a problem with the locals, who are the Khoi and the Sons, from welcoming them, but their hidden motives.
I want to challenge you on that based on contemporary history, but before we get there, I want to bring into the conversation Professor Malusi Langa, who's a professor of psychology from Wits University, who is also a senior researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Prof. Langa, I want to perhaps start here. Are we as a society collectively desensitized to violence, so much so that it can persist unabated?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I also want to fully agree with my fellow panelists. Yeah, I mean, we're at a point where I remember a colleague of mine, Brown Harris, some years ago, had a paper entitled "Violence Has Become Our Daily Bread." And obviously what she meant by that is that almost like on a daily basis, we get exposed to different forms of violence, to a point where it has become quite normal. And you see it happening in different contexts. If you think about our different institutions, including schools, including communities where we live, including workplaces, we see different forms of violence. But obviously, the question that we need to be put into the fore is that who are the perpetrators of this violence and who are the victims? And of course, I want to echo what a colleague of mine has sort of said. I mean, in the studio, around our history, that there is no way we can talk about violence in this country without referring to our past. And I want to give a very practical example. If you look at our stats in terms of who are the perpetrators of the most violent crimes in this country, the stats show that it's of course it's young men between the age of 18 and 35. If you were to look at that age category and look at when many of them were born, many of them were born around 1990, 1993, 1994, 1995. And obviously it's where the whole notion of, the born free or the Mandela children mantra started sort of developing. But of course, if you start there, you're going to miss the history, to say, if then you're to ask who are the parents of these children who were born around that period. Many of them were born around the 70s and the 60s and so on and so forth. So obviously the genealogy, the back you go, the better understanding of why are we seeing the violence that we are seeing right now. But we also see how the past gets reenacted in the present moment. And of course now, I guess when we had the fees must fall, I think a lot of issues were highlighted, and some of them was the issue of the coloniality and the need to decolonize, I guess difference of spaces.
Yeah.
But also what that moment sort of showed us was that we really need to go back to the past. And the last point is also the emergency of necklacing cases, because obviously now many communities are feeling very tired of the rampant increasing levels of violent crime in our communities.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. The mantra that violence begets violence seems to be what underpins some of your analysis there, Prof. Langa. But we are going to take a touch on that in the second half of this conversation. Do stick around with us. I'm in conversation with Dr. Moloi as well as Professor Langa. We're asking the question, why is South Africa such a deeply violent country 30 years into our democracy, which was meant to put an end to violence? We're going to take a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Democracy 30. Thank you so much for staying with us. Really do appreciate it. Tonight we ask the question, why is South Africa such a deeply violent country evading the rule of law 30 years into our democracy? My guests this evening are Dr. Lehasa Moloi, an Afrocentric Scholar from UNISA's Department of Development Studies, and joining us over Zoom is Professor Malose Langa, who's a professor of psychology from the Wits University and is also a senior researcher at the Center for Violence and Reconciliation. Before we go back to the conversation, I want to take your attention to a graph demonstrating and illustrating to us just how deeply violent South Africa is, particularly when we look at the rate of murder in the country. Around 2003-2004, we had 43 people murdered in South Africa per day, right? And that is measured as really as a concentration of our population per 100,000 people. When you look at the rate of murder per 100,000 people in 2022-23, it has risen just slightly above those early 2000 figures. It dropped significantly, well, staggeredly over the last couple of years between after 2006 towards 2013, but picked up once again. It violently picked up in 2021 from 33 murders per 100,000 per capita. Just to give you a sense about what that looks like as a gross and nominal figure per day, it is more than 80 people, more than 80 South Africans being murdered per day, given that we're a population of 62 million people, and we're talking here of a concentration of 100,000 people per murder rate. Murder is perhaps, Dr. Moloi, the most indicative form and most illustrative form of violence in South Africa. The fact that life is so easily taken in South Africa should be deeply worrying to many of us. And you earlier on made the appeal to Afro-pessimism as a tool of analysis to make sense of violence. Can it help us make sense of gratuitous violence in the form of murder?
Like I said, that the very foundation of South Africa itself, it's informed exactly by the same kind of an attitude of the people that we are now talking about within the confines of the concentration centers called the townships, and the former concentration centers called the Bantustans. You were not actually dealing with human beings. You were dealing with barbarian monkeys that were subjected mainly to certain forms of slavery. So in a way, when you deal with people from that purview, automatically that culture replicates itself. But at the same time, like I was saying, that when you deal with the three political epochs in the context of history, from the arrival of the Dutch, followed by the British, and followed by Afrikaner nationalism, from the Union of South Africa to the Republic of South Africa to the new idea of South Africa, we find that kind of a marriage of a build-up in which our sense of an expectation that negotiated settlement between the ANC and the former National Party meant that we have succumbed to the situations of depravity that we are coming from. It is not true, and which is why sometimes I make a differentiation between freedom and emancipation. Freedom, you take it, and we could not be able to overcome apartheid. So in a way, while we can deal with the sense of a gruesome manifestation of the brutality of murder cases, to what extent do we think of religion also as a form of violence, deculturalization as a form of violence? How do we think of Bantu education, which is the rewiring of the mind of the African people into dislocation, as a form of violence and the denial? So in a way, those manifestations are actually showing a devolute life.
Yeah. Prof. Lang, I want to bring you in here. Can we re-engineer our society to find a renewed appreciation for the sanctity of life, but more importantly, to also unlearn violence? Can you unlearn and unteach violence in a society as deeply violent and endemic to it as ours?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to start with the graph that you before I answer your question, like around if whether the violent behavior can be unlearned or not. But if you look at those numbers, it's like almost like 43 people dying per day. But if you break down that number of saying who are these people, the high percentage of them are young men. So obviously here we're talking about male to male violence or male homicide. And of course it raises questions. Why do you have such a high percentage of young men dying as a result of violence? Obviously there are a lot of factors that are contributing to that. And some of them obviously is the issue of access to guns, because when we break down those numbers, is that 18 to 23 of those murders are committed through use of guns. So obviously those are some of the risk factors. So obviously then if you're to talk about the unlearning, and obviously I mean I agree with what the colleague has said in terms of the history. But the learning of violent behavior, and I've always given this an example, to say no one is born sort of violent. You become socialized. From a very young age, you get all kinds of messages about the need for you to prove that you are tough, you're strong, you're this and this and this and this. And obviously those are the messages that get propagated through all kinds of institutions. And for us to begin to unlearn is to then deinstitutionalize violent messages. And of course, one ways of doing that, practically, is to then say, I mean, even in schools, in our homes, we need to then be discouraging, I guess, all kinds of violent behaviors.
Yeah.
And of course, if homes and institutions sort of begin to sort of transform, also bigger institutions, because if you talk about violence, we're not only talking about physical violence. There's symbolic form of violence where now you have the haves and the have-nots, and obviously people are living precarious lives. They don't have access to certain services. It's a form of violence, and it's symbolic in nature. And that form of violence, more often, it is perpetrated by state institutions. So often when you talk about violence, in fact, we are talking about murder rate and everything,
structure.
but we're not talking about where people are living in uninhabitable living conditions where obviously they don't have access to water, they don't have access to electricity.
Just to be clear, Prof. Langa, just to be clear, is your argument that poverty is inherently structurally violent and violence begets violence, so for as long as we have poverty, we'll have violence?
I mean, that's the heart of this, because living under such conditions is very dehumanizing, where now it has been very cold over the last few weeks. And then you can imagine if you're living in a shed where obviously, I mean, you would not sleep very well, and it leaves you, I guess feeling unhuman, okay? And more often, when incidents of violence are being committed, more often we then begin to ask about, why did they kill this person? Why didn't they just take a cell phone and so on and so forth? Because at that moment we expect this person to be human. Yeah. But all along, the conditions were dehumanizing this person.
Can I pause you there?
Structurally, we definitely need to do something where all of us are in touch with our humanity.
Yeah. Can I pause you there, Prof. Langa, because can I pause you there, because I want us to take a look in congruent with that, at how deeply violent South Africa is compared to the rest of our counterparts on the continent of comparable societies. Take a look at this graph, which gives us an indication of violence it spread across the continent, with South Africa forming there 5 of the top 10 most violent cities on the continent are South African countries. Pretoria, Durban, Johannesburg, and Port Elizabeth, Cape Town being the top 5 most violent or highest crime cities on the continent, with our counterparts like Lagos, Harare, Nairobi, and Casablanca forming the bottom half of that, Windhoek falling right to the middle of that. So it's an African-wide problem, and the spread of that is not so far apart. Dr. Moloi, perhaps just to give you a last comment here.
Yes.
Your argument is that violence is an origination of the colonial settlement on the continent and in the country. But some may argue that a phenomenon like Mfecane of the 1800s was not a colonial form of violence, yet became endemic and illustrative of the deep-rooted violence in our society.
I think what we would now consider as Mfecane or simply as a black and black violence, the proper look at it must be understood in terms of the factors that were responsible for creating that kind of a displacement. When people's context become invaded, the proclivity towards displacement becomes very high as they run around searching for survival. But at the same time, am I simply purely putting the current disarrangement in the context of the country due to the colonial legacy, to the neglect of the fact that maybe 30 years that we have had, there should have been something that is actually happening? I think where we have a weak state that is unable to strengthen its own institutions, that is unable to service its own people, the conditions are created that makes violence easily permissible. For example, I mean, we are dealing with about 66% of youth unemployment. What else can people do? And so I think for me, this is where we also have got to take some degree of responsibility without neglecting the history as a fermenter of all evil. But
Absolutely.
at some point,
Yeah.
we've got to pause and be able to take responsibility.
I'm unfortunately going to have to stop you there. This is sadly all that we have time for this evening. I do want to thank you, Dr. Moloi, for your insights. You're a fantastic interlocutor. Prof. Langa, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. We continue the conversation, of course, on our social media platforms. Tweet us your thoughts on this conversation at SABC News. You can find me. It is at Oliver_speaking on Twitter, Oliver Dixon on Facebook. But for now, from myself and the team, thank you so much for being with us. This has been another fantastic installment of Democracy 30. We'll be back with you next week, Sunday at 8 p.m. Set those alarms. Good night.